Last year I tested 7 of the most popular ultra high performance all season tyres in the dry, wet and snow, and across all the tests the Michelin Pilot Sport All Season 4 averaged out to be the best tyre overall. Since then, 2 of the key competitors have had plus updates, the Continental ExtremeContact DWS06 Plus and the Bridgestone Potenza RE980AS Plus. Bit of a mouthful. And as you all asked me to test the Pirelli, which is a bit of an older tyre, I have the Pirelli P0 All Season Plus as well in the test. Can either of the new tyres take it to the Michelin, or will the old boy, will the Pirelli keep up? Let's go find out.
Snow grip is arguably the least important quality of an ultra high performance all season tyre, as they probably spend way more time in the dry and wet. However, it's arguably also one of the most important, as when you meet snow, that's when you need the extra grip. So the snow handling test is an important one and also the most fun. The slowest tyre on test is the Pirelli P0 All Season Plus. Now, let's not forget, an all-season tyre is a compromise. You have a box and you can have dry performance, wet performance and snow performance, and you can't be the best in all of them. So it might be that Pirelli have optimized the P0 All-Season Plus for the dry and wet. So we'll find that out later in the video when we do the dry and wet testing. But in the snow, it just wasn't the best. I think it was 13 seconds off the fastest tyre of the test. The next quickest tyre, much closer and only about 5 seconds off the best, was the new Continental ExtremeContact DWS06 Plus. Now this tyre was much faster than the Pirelli, but the grip circle wasn't entirely rounded. The issue with the Conti is the levels of grip were good, but once you passed the limit of grip, it took a long time for the tyre to come back to you. So you were sliding a long time and you really had to stay off the throttle, which cost it time. And this tyre was primarily understeer primary. That means the front axle was sliding. You give it a little bit of steering angle, and unlike this tyre, which is the Michelin I'm driving on, when you turn in, the car turns and rotates. The Continental would just understeer. Now, I'm not a big fan of understeer, as I'm sure you're all aware of, so it definitely wasn't my favourite tyre to drive on, but you can argue that understeer is safe for the road. The second fastest tyre was last year's reigning snow champion, the Michelin Pilot Sport All Season 4. Now, while this tyre wasn't quite the fastest, it still had the subjective champion crown. That means it was the nicest and easiest to drive on and allows you to do really simple slides one-handed while you're talking and just slide around. It was progressive past the limit, so while it wasn't the fastest, it definitely is still the most graceful and enjoyable to drive. So if you're going to go snow drifting at some point, get yourself on the Michelin, because it's a fun tyre to drive in the snow. But it wasn't the fastest, and the fastest was the new Bridgestone Potenza RE980 Plus. Well done, Bridgestone. Your non-plus version was in my test last year, and it was 6 or 7 seconds off the Michelin, and it's the same Michelin this year, although the conditions are ever so slightly slower. You'll see in the times, if you go back and look at the times from last year's test, you'll see the actual track's a little bit slow because it's the same car and same tyre for the Michelin. The Bridgestone has made a huge leap forward. It was primarily, the grip was primarily given to you in traction and braking. So you did get to the corner very quickly because you were quick at the last corner, and then the brakes were mighty impressive. Where it lost out was once it broke into sliding like this, it wasn't as progressive as the Michelin, so you were working harder. It just took longer to come back. It would slide out more quickly and then take a little bit longer to come out. So it was a little bit harder to drive, but you can't argue with the levels of grip it offered. It was a very impressive grip for an ultra high performance all season tyre. Does this mean Bridgestone have taken too much away from dry and wet? Because the Bridgestone, the 980 was one of my favourite tyres in the dry and wet, if I remember last year's test. Well, we shall find that out right after I go and do some traction and braking tests to see which tyre is best in a straight line. And I think it's probably going to be the Bridgestone from my subjective testing, but let's go find out.
And it was, with the Bridgestone leading in both traction and braking, followed by the Michelin, Continental and Pirelli. Let's move on to wet.
As I said in the snow, an all-season tyre is a compromise of many things, and that has been highlighted by the fact the best tyre in snow, which was the Bridgestone, was also the slowest around the wet handling lap. But also that's been unhighlighted by the fact the Pirelli, which was the slowest around the snow handling lap, was joint slowest with the Bridgestone. Basically things are very close in the wet, partly because wet condenses things and partly because this wet handling course is quite short. While the Bridgestone and Pirelli did essentially tie on time, they did feel a little bit different. The Bridgestone was the woolliest tyre of the group. It felt more like an all-season tyre than an ultra-high performance tyre. You just felt a bit of block movement, and although the initial steering was fine, the turn-in and stability mid-corner was the lowest of the four. The Pirelli, conversely, although like I said, it matched it on time, was probably the most dynamic. It had the quickest initial steering, which was nice, and then it gave you a little bit more detail than the rest, although these differences, they are quite small. The Continental and Michelin was so close on time and subjective steering feel, I don't think the average driver or even an enthusiast driver will have the situation to really like notice the differences. But because this is quite an extreme wet handling lap, there were some slight differences. And that was, the Continental was a little bit more abrupt when it went sideways than the Michelin, and the Michelin was a bit more progressive, but that perhaps was due to a little bit more aquaplaning on the rear axle, and the Michelin just had a little bit more understeer in the wet than the Continental. But like I said, these two are so close. Both tyres have done an amazing job, and they're both very impressive in the wet. They're all pretty impressive, to be fair. These are all premium tyres. To find out some further differences, or to see if we could find some further differences, we also ran a big wet circle which had some deeper parts of water, not full depth hydroplaning tests, sadly we didn't get time to do that, but in this circle the Continental had a small advantage, but then the advantage swung back to Michelin in the wet braking test by the smallest amount. So essentially these two are so close in the wet you can't decide between them. So let's see if we can find some more differences in the dry. The dry performance of the tyres, would you believe, is very close. The Bridgestone, the softness to the construction or the blocks highlighted a little bit more in the dry, as you would expect, because the forces are higher. So any compression or movement that you're experiencing in the wet is going to be higher in the dry, obviously, and it cements it in my mind that the Bridgestone is the one that's focused more on the all-season side of the UHP all-season blend. The Continental, Michelin and Pirelli was so close across the 72nd lap. I do 2 laps, average the times, and they were so close, there was less than 2/10 covering all 3 tyres, that's close. Of the 3, again, the Pirelli felt the most UHP. Its steering was just a little bit quicker, and while it did match a little bit of detail mid-corner perhaps, it's the one, if you want to use a UHP all-season tyre on track, that would be the one I picked, because it also managed to heat well. But these tyres are not intended for track, so let's not pretend they're a track day tyre. If you want to do track days on a road tyre, get a summer tyre, guys. The Continental and Michelin, again, almost too close to separate. The Continental had a little bit more front-end grip turning into the corner. I wouldn't say the steering speed or reaction was any difference between the two, but the Continental just turning in mid-corner, it had a little bit more grip, whereas the Michelin would understeer. That, like in the wet, did mean the rear end was just a little bit more flighty, but it wasn't sudden or uncontrollable. Both tyres were incredibly good. Remember, this is a very high grip track, and the ambient air temperature is over 70, so that means the surface is well over 80. Out of the operating window of these tyres, none of these tyres should be doing this, but it's very impressive that they all can do it. What about the braking of the tyres? The hard braking. Well, the Conti and Michelin almost drew again, would you believe it? Then it was the Bridgestone, and then it was the Pirelli, but close group overall, with the Pirelli just perhaps a little bit behind. If you're wanting comfort from your ultra performance all-season tyre, you're going to be looking at the Michelin or Continental too, because both of these were very close. The Michelin did have a small edge in rounding out bigger impacts, and then it was the Bridgestone and then the Pirelli, because the Pirelli, what you gain in steering response and enjoyment on track, you generally lose in comfort, and over the bigger impacts there was quite a noticeable crash. But I've had a lot of fun. I hope you found this interesting, and let's just move on to the summary.
So there we have it. Sadly, the Pirelli is showing its age a little bit, but what it lacks up in outright grip in the snow and the wet, it does make up for in dynamic handling. So it's a fun tyre to drive. The Bridgestone, Well, that is definitely more all-season than ultra-high performance, because they seem to have optimized it, especially compared to its predecessor, where it's taken a big step forward in snow for the bad weather. But that does come at the expense of dry and wet handling, where the handling feels a little bit spongy. Definitely a very good tyre, but maybe if you're looking for that ultra-high performance side of the UHP all season, perhaps it's not the best tyre at the moment. But for those kind of middle sedan cars that want a bit of sporty handling and good snow performance, absolutely recommended. These two, the Michelin and the Continental, well, these two are so close in the dry and wet, they're almost inseparable. The Continental does have a very slight advantage. However, when we flip it back to snow, the Continental is, while it's closer than the non-plus version to this in the snow, it is still a step behind. So while both of these are absolutely excellent tyres, if you had to pick just one, the Michelin still holds the advantage by the smallest amount, but these are both very good tyres. I actually have this tyre in my personal vehicle at home, and I'm very happy to have it. I would be very happy fitting these. If I lived in an area with lots of snow, I'd be happy with these. And I'm super excited to see what Pirelli do next with the All Season Plus range, because this tyre is, I think, 7 or 8 years old, and it's not that far off these tyres. So very impressive considering its heritage and its sportiness. That's what I like from Pirelli, but it can't quite keep up with the new guys. As always, any questions, please ask below, hit like and subscribe, and safe motoring.